This is the Nashville Bar Association oral history interview with Judge Keith Lundin. Today is the second day of May 2016, and I'm John McLemore, the interviewer. Judge Lundin, give us your full name and your date of birth.
Can you call me Keith?
I can call you whatever you'd like, but right now I just need to get your full name and date of birth.
It's Keith Lundin, June 15th, 1951.
And so you have the same aversion to your middle name as your father did to Isidore?
Yeah, that's true. No, it's Michael.
Yes, it is Michael.
I had a real middle name, and he didn't, it turned out.
Lundin is not the real family name. It got shortened at Ellis Island.
Yeah, it did.
Tell us a little bit about the family Lundin coming to Ellis Island.
Best we can tell, the Lundin side came out of Siberia or out of Poland. There's a little disagreement about which one. We think it came out of Bialystok, which was right on the border between Russia and Poland, and it bounced back and forth depending on what political party was in power at one time or another. There's a grandfather who came in through Ellis Island about, well, it doesn't matter when it was, but I actually read the records. I went there. I did what you do, you know. John went out and looked at records and museums and things. And there's a card for him coming in to the United States, and it has a code on it that he came into the United States with a babe in arms. And there's a little code for that, which, you know, you and I think it probably means he had a kid with him, except the guy was 18 years old and he wasn't married. And we have no idea who this babe in arms was or where it came from or whether it was even his, you know. It was not uncommon for, in the queue as you came into Ellis Island, people sorted out family members to make it easiest to get in. And we have no idea. We've never been able to figure it out.
But this was during or about the time of the Russian Revolution, is that correct? Around 1917.
Yeah, 15 or 16, 17, right around in there, yeah.
Do you know what his last name was?
It was a long name, a little disagreement about that. We think it was Ludonovitsky or something close to that.
And so the helpful man at the front counter?
Lundin, yeah. All right, just got changed and misspelled. You know, it came out as Lundin, who knows? Yeah.
What about the maternal line?
That one we're sure about, because it's a hoot. Because on my mother's side, we've got that one traced back to the 14th century, literally to the 1320s in Padua, Italy. And the only reason that you can get that kind of certainty is that they were rabbis in Italy when all the Jews were thrown out of Italy. And they had perfect records. We know exactly who he was and how many siblings, and there's actually a book in the 19th century, in the early 1800s, that has a chart in it of my mother's family all the way back to Padua, Italy, and to the when the Jews were thrown out of when they were thrown out of Italy. So we have that whole family.
And so the newly created Lundin family stayed in New York.
They did. They did.
Your father was born in New York?
Yep. In the Bronx.
And this brings us to what I think is an absolutely fascinating part of your family history, and that is, how did Keith Lundin get to Oak Ridge? And it begins on a train in the middle of the night, perhaps Grand Central Station, perhaps Pennsylvania Station, perhaps some other station. But tell us about your father. He was an educated man. He had a degree. Where did he go to college?
It's funny. There's thousands of stories like the one I'm getting ready to tell, but they're all told by people from Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I mean, we all had exactly the same experience. At least all the ones of us who are in our mid-60s now, and even a little older, because my dad went to City College in New York on a scholarship. On a Regents scholarship, which was a big deal back in those days, because he he was just short of 15 years old when he started college. He had, as I've been told by people, he had no personality at all, but he was brilliant. And he started college before he was 15. And he graduated when he was just after his 18th birthday with a degree, an engineering degree from City College in New York. And he got drafted in 1941, or late 41, right in there. They all got drafted. Mm-hmm. It turned out that basically every engineer that graduated from City College at that time got drafted because the military needed engineers desperately. And they told him that this is his version of the story, and I've no reason to doubt this. They told him that they were going to somewhere to a fort in Georgia.
They were going to Camp Benning.
Maybe Camp Benning, okay, going to Camp Benning. They put him on trains in New York with hundreds of other people just like him. And he had the physical, he had to take all of the physical and everything, and he flunked the physical, John. The guy had really weird feet, and he flunked the physical, and they didn't care. And he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of folks on these trains that were not fit to be soldiers. Put them on the train, told them where they were going. They never got there. A couple of days later, they found themselves at a railroad siding in Knoxville. They never got to Georgia, and they were all put on buses and trucks and taken to this place that didn't exist. I mean, it didn't exist. It was the secret city is what it was called, and that's still the nickname of Oak Ridge. They were sent there to build a city because the government had decided that was a great location to build facilities that were going to handle nuclear material. It's isolated. It has hills that goes like this, and so they could put plants in between the hills, and if one of them blew up, it wouldn't take the other ones with it. I mean, I'm not making it up. That really was why it went, and they had TVA right there, so that they had, and they at one time they were using 85% of the power being generated by the Tennessee Valley Authority was being used in that in a 1 square mile area right around the gaseous diffusion plant in Oak Ridge. But they all ended up in Oak Ridge.
Was he ever sworn into the Army?
We haven't been able to figure it out. I investigated that. I wanted to find out if he had any veterans benefits a few years ago, and no one that in the usual channels where you send those inquiries and make those calls, nobody could verify. But I have commendations from the Department of the Army to him in 1944 and 45, around in there, to him. There's no rank shown and no military numbers, but it was from the Army. So,
did he recall ever being sworn in?
When I asked him, "Were you in the Army?" he says, "I don't know." That's what he told me.
That's a good enough answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then your mother, was she able to come to Oak Ridge, to the secret city?
Yeah, she was in the same boat as all of the women who were married to those guys that got drafted and sent there in the middle of the night. They had to go through security clearances. And that was a process at the time that took months. So there was a period of months and months after they were married when she couldn't get into the city. He couldn't get out of the city, and she couldn't get into the city because there were these big fences and these guard towers and everything. And the people who were building Oak Ridge were terrified of spies. They really were worried about it. I mean, and so after, it was months before she could get in. And it's ironic because, of course, they were doing a security check, right? My mother was from Queens, from Far Rockaway in New York. And there would be no records of her at all, except that she was born and went to high school in Queens. My dad had been a member of the Communist Party because he was in the chess club at City College in New York. He was a killer chess player. I always hated him. I could never beat him in chess. But everybody in the chess club in City College in 1940 was in the Communist Party. they all were. This is how he described it to me. He explained it. And they let him in anyway. But about a decade later, in the early 50s, one of the times when they were renewing his security clearance, because he had a top secret security clearance, the chess club came up. And the irony of that, I mean, you think about it. He'd spent 10 years, the first 5 or 6 years of his professional life building the first atomic bomb. And then 5 years later, they figure out that he's a communist, right? So it was crazy.
But they got housing on the reservation.
Yeah, everybody started out in tents, and then they went to sort of slightly better structures, and then this outfit called MSI, Management Services Incorporated, which was in charge of housing in Oak Ridge, started building houses, and they built A houses and B houses and C houses and D houses. There may have been an E house, I'm not sure, but they were all the same, right? All the A's were the same, and they were all made out of the same thing too. It was this stuff called cemesto, which was mostly asbestos, it turns out. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, you can't. And if you had no kids and you were of a certain status in the community in Oak Ridge, you might get an A house. Otherwise, you rented an apartment. You got an apartment in one of the apartment buildings, one of the multi. And then when you had a kid, you got better. And then when you had 2 kids, you had better. So when I was born in 1951, I was the second child. And my father was eligible for a D house, which had 2 bedrooms, had 3 sort of, 2.5 bedrooms kind of in it, and 2 bathrooms. And so he bought the house a few weeks after I was born in 1951 for $4,500. He bought the house that they owned the rest of their lives in Oak Ridge.
And so he was a career government worker at Oak Ridge.
Started out that way, government, because the government owned everything. And then pretty soon you had, the Atomic Energy Commission was there, but it had a lot of contractors. And he worked for each one of the contractors over a period of, it was Union Carbide for a while, and then it was, it went through several different contractors, and he worked for every one of them one time or another. In other words, they were the first nuclear engineers, but that didn't exist when they got there in 1941. There was no such thing. He was a mechanical engineer. But what they did was figure out how to enrich uranium so that the people in Chicago were working on, Fermi and all of that group were working on how to make the bomb, but the people in Oak Ridge were enriching the uranium. They were trying to figure out how to make enough enriched uranium so the bomb would work.
And your father was quite proud of his work in filtration, as I understand it.
When he was about in the late 1990s, they did an oral history like this in Oak Ridge, and they tracked down a bunch of the old timers. And he was one of the ones that was still alive. Most of them died very young for obvious reasons. They all messed around with exposures to radioactive materials, and it was one of the sort of canned questions to every one of the old guys when they were interviewing them. They said, "Well, Mike, what were you most proud of all the things you did as an Oak Ridger for 50 years? What were you most proud of?" And his answer, I read it in the transcript of the thing. He says, "It didn't leak." And that's completely enigmatic, right? What the hell does that mean? It didn't leak. And so, of course, the interviewer follows up and says, "Well, wait a minute, you need to explain that. What do you mean it didn't leak?" And he said the pump didn't leak. Well, what pump? What are we talking about? He said, well, they had to design, they meaning the engineering group, and there were 4,000 engineers working on this project. They had to build a pump that could pump the gas that had the uranium in it. It was uranium hexafluoride, I think is what it was, or something like that. They had to pump it at very high pressures and temperatures through thousands and thousands and thousands of filters, very, very, very fine filters, until the 235 and the 238 were separated from each other. And it was this endless process. At one time, it was the largest building in the world in Oak Ridge, the gaseous diffusion plant, just thousands and thousands. And every stage, every little filter had to have a pump on it, and it couldn't leak. If the pump leaked, it would kill everybody around you, right? As the enrichment process went on, you'd be exposed to the higher grade of uranium, and this was not a good thing. And also the things that were in there, they used mercury in gaseous form. They used mercury in this process, and it would just kill people, right? It's very, so imagine it. I mean, he was proud. The thing he said, it didn't leak, the pump.
So you lived your life inside the gate at Oak Ridge.
Did. Until they blew up the gates. They had a big celebration and blew up the gates. They did.
That makes me feel very comfortable.
Don't you feel good about that? Yeah, they blew up the gates.
And you went to the Oak Ridge school system.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about the Oak Ridge school system. It was the best in the state, and everybody recognized it was the best in the state.
John, it was a gene pool. It was a mutant gene pool. Oak Ridge was. I mean, come on. At time when I started in Oak Ridge, when I was born in Oak Ridge, I think there were 75,000 people there. I mean, there's about 20,000 there today. The city's gone. I mean, it's completely. But those 75,000 people were some of the smartest people in a set of disciplines, in engineering, in physics, in chemistry, in material science. It was the very early stages there of ceramics, of glass, of all kinds of things. I mean, they were the masters, doctorates, and best of a whole generation of people, mostly men, but people, and thousands of them were sent there. At one time, I read there was something like there were 9,000 PhDs in a city of 75,000 people. And so you can imagine what the school system was like. I mean, the first public building was a library. Makes sense, right?
If you read history, the first public building is always a church.
The churches followed. In fact, for a time, there was only one. There was one church up on the hill, and everybody used it. It was a hoot. The government was in control, John, and there was going to be a church, but only one, right, for a while. And so they all shared it. All the denominations of people who had been for a time, there were hundreds of Jewish families in Oak Ridge for a while. There weren't anywhere else.
Did you have your own rabbi, or was he on the circuit?
God, I don't think we had one until I was probably a teenager. Before that, yeah. But you get the idea. The school system was crazy. My graduating class from high school, there were 28 National Merit finalists in my class. 28 in my class.
And how many students were in your class?
300 maybe.
Okay.
And so I was told this years later by a friend of mine who knows a lot about testing and college entry and all of that stuff, that Oak Ridge was simply removed from the statistics and from the scoring because it didn't fit. The city didn't fit. It was a statistical anomaly in all of the testing. I mean, one of the families that was a close friend of mine had 2 national spelling bee champions, brother and a sister. The math contest, the national algebra math contest, You know, I was in that. I remember, and when you finally got to the table, it was all the kids in my class. I mean, it was crazy. It was.
And you were in the old class of 1969.
69.
And you were accepted by the usual suspects: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Michigan, Stanford.
Yeah.
You chose Brown. Why did you go to Brown University?
The short version is that it was the entering class in '69 at Brown was going to be an experimental class that was not going to have to take grades. You could go to college without being graded, no grades for your class. And there were no distribution requirements. So you had to take 32 classes, and you had to pass 32 classes. But if you wanted to take 32 Spanish classes or 32 math classes, you could. Now, they would try to talk you out of it, and they told you in advance, we're going to try to talk you out of it, but you don't have to distribute your classes anyway. Well, that sounded like a hell of a lot of fun to me.
Who had come up with this idea?
It's, you know how the world goes around and comes around. The year before, there'd been this study done at Brown, and the committee that studied Brown to figure out what the new curriculum ought to look like was a man named Ira Magaziner. Ira Magaziner, the same Ira Magaziner, though, if you are thinking about it right now. Ira went on to be the health policy expert in the Clinton administration when Bill and Hillary were working on creating all of that stuff. And he also ended up befriending Byron Trauger here in Nashville, who many of us know. And Byron ended up as a Rhodes Scholar, and Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar when Byron was a Rhodes Scholar. Ira Magaziner was a Rhodes Scholar, and it was just incest. All these people all knew each other. And then Nancy Ann Min, who many people know here in Tennessee because she became the head of the department. It was then called the Department of Human Services, I think. It has a new name now. Nancy Ann was from Kingston. Byron Trauger was from Oak Ridge. He went to kindergarten with me and his smarter younger brother, Tom, who's a lawyer up in Massachusetts. But the point of that is that there was this really odd connection that I found out about years later. Magaziner goes through Brown, graduates Brown, writes this new curriculum. I went there because of this new curriculum. I really liked that idea of not having to take English if I didn't want to. That was really good to me. And then not very many years later, I got to know Ira, but I also I found all these connections to all these people going back to when I was in kindergarten. It was like it just all fit together. And Byron ended up, his first marriage was to Nancy Ann Min. Byron Trauger did.
And
and she incidentally clerked for Gil Merritt. Just incidentally, John.
Okay.
Just name dropping now, you know.
Well,
course,
that's a good thing.
Folks who are watching will know that Gil Merritt went on the Sixth Circuit, and while he was on the Sixth Circuit, Nancy Ann clerked for Gil.
And what did you decide to take when you got to Brown?
I started out in applied math because we had a computer in Oak Ridge, of course, in high school in the 60s. And it was one of these pegboard machines that you programmed, an old IBM 1620, I think it was. I don't know, it doesn't matter. But I learned how to program, and I loved it. And that was in the applied math department at Brown. And so I started out in applied mathematics. But I was too lazy to finish in applied. If I had stayed there, John, I would have had this amazing life. Because Tom Watson from IBM, had set up a laboratory at Brown to build this thing that they were tentatively calling a personal computer. And it was the size of this room at the time, but their goal was to get it down to the size of a Volkswagen. That was what they were hoping for.
And everybody was going to have one in their home.
And everybody someday would have one of those in their home. And now they have them in their back pocket, but in their home. And every kid I know who went to Brown in the late 60s or early 70s who stayed in applied mathematics retired 25 years ago with $1 gazillion because they were the first wave of computer science. They were the guys that wrote the operating systems for your telephone. They're the men and women who figured out how to miniaturize things. They went to, yeah. I was too lazy. I was going to have to work too hard, so I went to political science instead because I didn't have to work, and finished a degree in political science, and then did a second one. You could make your own major. You could design it yourself, and so I made one called public policy making because it let me take whatever I wanted to. So I took a bunch of economics and a bunch of political science and got a second AB. Yeah, there while I was there. Yeah.
You told me a story one time, and it's one of the better stories, college stories I've ever heard. And I'm hoping that it is true.
I've forgotten.
I know we haven't talked about this story since you told it to me 15 or 20 years ago.
What was that?
The story of you're not going to the homecoming your freshman year and studying instead. And on Sunday morning, you went down to the showers.
Oh, God! It was right at the beginning. It was in the fall of my freshman year.
Yeah.
This is a true story.
Tell the story.
No, this is a true story. I think I'm still traumatized by it, John. I think well, look, I was 18 years old. I came out of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, right?
Yep.
And I knew that the dorms, the freshman dorms at Brown were there were men and women in the dorms, and at the time there were fights about that in a lot of universities, and especially about how men had hours or didn't have hours and women did, when they had to be in. Mm-hmm. People watching this are not even going to think that's possible, that somebody could tell you when you had to be in the dorm. In any case, this dorm was co-ed, but not, it was kind of separated. And I hope this is the story you think I told you. But I don't know what time of night or morning it was, but I go down to the bathroom on the hall mm-hmm. where I am, and I go in, and I go in to take a shower, and I'm not the only person in the shower. There's a woman in the shower and showering mm-hmm. in the usual way, and there's a guy in the shower also, and I didn't know what to do, John. Honestly, I did not. This was not something that ever happened to me before, that moment in time. They didn't seem to think anything of it, and pretty much just ignored me. And it was an interesting moment.
Okay. Now, later on, you had a blind date.
Wow.
And it was the woman in the shower?
Yeah, it was the woman in the shower. I had forgotten about this completely.
I don't see how you could ever forget about it.
That's pretty good. No, it was. And she was a lovely person. It turned out. Even with her clothes on.
So you'd actually met the blonde date before?
And you are exactly right. You are. Needless to say, she was a bit more advanced socially than I was. At 18.
So you're in Providence, Rhode Island.
I am.
And you've got to make the leap to Nashville, Tennessee. How does that occur?
I got married. I was getting ready to get out. I was getting out of college, and I was going to go to law school because that was all you could do with a political science degree. I wanted to go. I thought it'd be fun, and I applied a bunch of places. And the woman who had been my high school sweetheart in Oak Ridge, her name was Linda Schachter. wanted to go to medical school. So she and I decided we were going to get married, and she applied to medical schools, I applied to law schools, and we had to match up so that we could go together. And it was odd, but at the time, the school that listened to us, that we were a pair and that we had to both get in, was Vanderbilt. And so frankly, I had no intention of ever going back. I was enjoying New England. I liked it, and I liked how different it was from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and from Tennessee in general. But I wanted to get married more, so I came back to go to Vanderbilt Law School. Yeah.
And you got your first job clerking as a result of Jeannie Nelson.
I did. Yeah, thank you. Remind me, I did. It was that first year writing program at Vanderbilt where at the time, and this would have been 1973, at the time they had third year students supervising first year students in how to write, okay? Or they were teaching us how to unlearn everything we'd ever learned about writing. And my third year advisor was Jean Nelson, or it was Jean, was it Jean Beckner maybe?
It was Jeannie Nelson Beckner.
That's exactly who it was, who you know and I know for many years since. But Jeannie was my writing advisor, and I really, she was really kind to me, but I was broke, and I said something to her one day, and she said that she thought she might know someplace where I could get a job, a part-time job, but they didn't like having first-year students work. We weren't supposed to work, so we were going to have to lie about that. But that was okay. And she introduced me to her husband, who was a lawyer, Jim Beckner, and his partner was John Chambers. So it was I think it was Chambers and Beckner at the time. So I started working for them in law school. I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
You graduated from law school?
Managed to do that, in spite of the fact that I showed up in my denims and long hair and everything that I had when I was in New England, and everybody was still in coats and ties at Vanderbilt in 1973, except for Matt Sweeney. Matt Sweeney, who you know as well. Matt was in my class, and Matt and I were the two guys. He was from New Jersey, I think, up there, or Seton, somewhere maybe. And he showed up looking about like I did. So.
And both of you became judges.
Well, that's right. That's right. We both. Yeah.
You graduated and you get a clerkship with the Sixth Circuit.
Yep.
Harry Phillips.
With Harry Phillips.
Tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about Judge Phillips.
Wow.
What it was like to work for him.
Wow. In hindsight, Harry Phillips had a lot of influence on me in ways I never realized it until you asked me that question when you and I had lunch a couple of weeks ago, because I hadn't thought about it. But Phillips was such an old South gentleman, and it was a kind of person that I hadn't spent any time with. There were no such people in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. They weren't there, and there certainly weren't any in Providence, Rhode Island, but Nashville had that kind of person, and he. A couple of things kind of defined him. He had some rules that. When you wrote things for him, as long as it was getting shorter, it was getting better. And it was just a principle of everything he did in life. It was to simplify it and make it understandable and make it shorter. And that became one of my things. But the other thing about Phillips was he had his principles, and he started from those principles and would work backwards from them. He was very much that kind of a judge, too. And we don't have many like that anymore. Sort of the antithesis of some of the Supreme Court justices today. I'll never forget one of the cases we had in the Sixth Circuit when I was working for him. I started there a little while ago. It was about hours at universities. It was one of the universities, either I think in Kentucky. It could have been Ohio, but I think it was Kentucky, where the women had to be in their dorms at 10, and the men at 12, and somebody brought a lawsuit and said that's discrimination against women, right? Which of course it was. I mean, it was absolutely obvious to me. And this is in 76 or so, 76 or 77, when we are all started litigating all that stuff. Frontiero versus Richardson had come out of the Supreme Court maybe in 72 or 3 or 4, around in there, and all of the women's rights stuff was cooking everywhere. And Judge Phillips says to me, I want you to draft this out for me. It can't be more than 10 pages long. And so I wrote out an opinion explaining why it was unconstitutional for a state institution to have different hours for men and women. And the way we typed all our own stuff then, you know, as bouncing ball typewriters and those.
They were called Selectric.
Them, yeah, Selectrics, and we did all our own. I typed the whole thing in. I brought it to him. I think it may have been 2.5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes after I dropped that draft off in his office. Judge Phillips comes in carrying that thing in his hand, shaking it like this. he comes back to my desk and he says, Keith, I have 4 daughters in college, and this will not be the law in the Sixth Circuit. Throws the thing down on the desk, and we wrote it the other way. That's too good. That's Harry Phillips. He was what an interesting man.
Was he killed while you were there?
Soon after. After that.
For those who may actually listen to this, Harry Phillips was killed in London at an American Bar Association convention when he forgot to look in the correct direction. He was hit by a bus as he was crossing the street.
Yeah, way too young, as they say. He was, and maybe the other, you think about it, there were no dissents in the Sixth Circuit in those days. He would work a case and keep working it and work it again and again and again until he could get a consensus on things. He was chief judge when I was there working for him. It was a whole way of looking at life in the world and especially looking at legal things. He thought it was very, very important for the Sixth Circuit to always speak with one voice. Yeah.
Had you continued to clerk with Chambers and...
God, I know why you're hesitating. You know, it was Chambers and Beckner, and then Tom Wiseman ran for governor, you know, in '74, and you know the great story. He came in 4th, I think, and in the primary, and the 3 guys that beat him all went to prison.
Okay, Ray Blanton
almost went to prison.
Okay, Ray Blanton really went to prison.
Yeah.
He would ultimately be elected governor.
Yeah.
And then Jake Butcher went to prison.
Yeah.
He really went to prison.
Yeah.
And he lost the Democratic primary.
Yep.
I don't know who the third one may have been.
The fellow from Chattanooga, whose name I'm blanking on right now. You'll think of it. It seems like he was a car dealer or something in Chattanooga. I'm blanking on it. Maybe later. Maybe you'll think of it some. Yeah.
Okay. But at any rate,
they all went. They all did eventually get into criminal problems of one kind or another. And Tom lost, but came out. He'd been state treasurer, and he moved to Nashville, and he hooked up with John Chambers, and went into practice with Jim Brackner and John Chambers and Tom Wiseman. And when I finished my clerkship, they made me a wonderful offer, and I came back. But all of a sudden, it was Tom Wiseman. It wasn't the law firm that I'd left when I went off to Clerk in '76. It was Wiseman.
Was there another young lawyer there?
Gosh,
associate with you?
Somewhere in there, some guy named George Payne had hooked up with that outfit.
University of Mississippi, I believe.
That one. After 29 tours in Vietnam and who knows what else he did.
Yes. Anyone interested in the life and legend of George Payne, mostly the legend, can listen to his oral history.
You should. And don't believe a word of it, because he doesn't.
But your mentor in the firm became Tom Wiseman.
Tom Wiseman. You hear about people carrying somebody else's briefcase, you know, as a euphemism, a way to describe it. I carried his briefcase. I really did. I went everywhere with him from 77 and 78 until he went on the district bench, which he did way too soon as far as I was concerned. Yeah.
And a lot of things were happening. Okay, the Blanton administration was under attack.
Yep.
It was under attack for good reason. There was all kind of chicanery going on, and
not the least of which had to do with liquor and liquor licenses.
Tell us about your liquor practice.
And Tom Wiseman had come out of the treasurer's office and had been hired by the wine and spirits wholesalers of Tennessee to be their lawyer. And you have to understand, this was early on. This was in the days when a lot of things happened with paper bags full of money in those days. I mean, literally, they did. And I saw these things. I mean, it's so long ago, there's no statutes limitation that we have to worry about here. But Tom came in to clean up the industry. I mean it. The leadership wanted him to make them, they were honest businessmen working really hard in a tough environment.
Whoa, just a second. You took economics at Brown.
I did.
And they remain an oligarchy, don't they?
Well, those are your words, John.
How many members are there of that can wholesale wine and spirits?
It's a franchise
in the state of Tennessee.
It's a franchise, just like selling cars or anything else. You know, you get a new brand. I mean, I remember another great Tom Wiseman story about Jack Daniels when the Motlow family was selling it. It's a brand, and you invest a lifetime and millions of dollars in developing that brand, and just because somebody up here gets sold to somebody else, that it shouldn't mean that you lose your investment in that brand. Now, I know that sounds like a commercial, but that was the statute that Tom and I wrote.
There were seven.
See, it's almost 40 years later.
Right.
It's still there, John.
40 years ago, there I believe 7 wholesalers in the state of Tennessee. Is that right?
More than that. About the same number there are today.
And what would that number be?
Well, it's something more like about 15, maybe 16, something like that.
Pretty exclusive club.
Invest a lot of money in something that nobody's ever heard of, that then becomes something that everybody's heard of, right?
And so each of the 15 had their select brands that they peddled.
They do, in their markets only, you know.
Right.
But that was Tom's client, and Tom had a huge influence on me. I watched him teach them a whole industry, including their lobbyists, Tom Hensley.
The Golden Goose.
That one,
yes.
Except it was Mr. Hensley, right? Teaching Mr. Hensley how to do things and how to do it completely legally, and Tom was one of the few people who could do that. He had the stature, and he had his compass was set that way. He never had any interest in anything any bags of money, and he wouldn't let them do it, and he cleaned them up. He did, but then he left.
Okay.
Precipitously, he was either gonna run for the Senate, or he was gonna have an opportunity to become a federal judge.
Okay, let's not get there quite yet. To set the stage, the Alcoholic Beverage Commission was doing things that attracted the attention of the United States Attorney during this time.
Yep.
And none of your clients went to prison.
That's true.
All right.
Not a one.
But Tom Wiseman wasn't in control of everybody who was doing business with the Alcoholic Beverage Commission.
No, there were quite a few others who got in trouble for not doing it the right way
during that particular time. Now, at the same time, Tom Wiseman had another client, and that was the finance industry.
He did. Bankers, Tennessee Bankers, I think they were Tennessee Bankers Association or something like that.
Yes, and the Patty decision had come down from the Tennessee Supreme Court. And when it became final as a Supreme Court decision, it stopped all lending in Tennessee for more than 10% simple interest.
Yep.
Which stopped a lot of lending in Tennessee. Car loans, mobile home loans, anything that had to do with retail installment sales contracts, that type of thing.
Yes.
They could not, those deals could no longer be done. And in the middle of this chaos of the investigation of the governor's office, we had to have a
constitutional convention. Yeah. Yeah. You probably covered it, didn't you?
No. By that time, I was a lawyer.
You were already a lawyer.
Yes.
Lawyer at that point. Okay.
I was trying to teach myself what the rule of 78s was,
what
and
was.
other very intriguing things.
Sure.
And read cases about Article 9. But the Constitutional Convention came, and Tom Wiseman was very active in that.
Yes.
And you were carrying his bag.
I was carrying his bags during that, but it was kind of funny because we had also gotten hired to litigate teachers' pension plans with the state of Tennessee at the same time, and these two things were going on at the same time, and so I was writing briefs and trying to figure out how to. The state of Tennessee had messed up to the teacher pension plan, had taken away a bunch of rights out of that. And I was doing that while Tom was doing the legislative thing, and we would meet in Printer's Alley about 5:30 every night and figure out where we were. I mean, literally, he'd come down from the hill and we would meet and see what was going on. He had an amazing practice. I mean, think about it. The wine and spirits wholesalers, the bankers, the pension plan. We were defending the state of Tennessee in that because he had been the treasurer. You know, he had a fantastic practice. Yeah, and I was the little kid. I was a kid following him around.
And then you had plenty to do. You were working 70-hour weeks.
Yeah, no question.
And
yes. And not getting it done.
And Jim Beckner had been appointed Chapter 13 trustee. And wasn't really satisfied with it. Did not really float his boat.
It didn't fit his professional interests.
And John Chambers comes to you and orchestrates a transfer.
And seems to me that Ruth Kennard had something in there also, because Ruth was a bankruptcy referee at the time. Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. And so you, not that you needed anything else to do, you became the Chapter 13 trustee.
I did. I didn't know what that was, but it sounded like something. I always had this kind of United Nations view about things, trying to do good collectively, and Chapter 13 sounded like a collective good to me, that people would pay their debts and that they'd have some protection. I liked all the concepts there. I didn't know anything about the detail of all of that.
Nor did the bar, really, at that time.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that it was truly an open range to go into Chapter 13. You did what you thought you could get away with in representing your client. And this begins, though, a theme in the remainder of your life, and that is you figured out pretty quickly that if you were going to do the job as Chapter 13 trustee, it had to be computerized.
Yeah. It came to me down the hall, right, from Jim Beckner. There was one person, it was manila folders with notes on it. And it pretty much did the same thing that it does today, in that debtors would give money. They'd send money to Jim Beckner and to the woman who worked for him. And they would record it on the back of a file. We got $500 from John McLemore today. And then they would divide out the money and send it to 8 or 10 or different creditors, and they'd write down who they sent money to and how much money they sent. And it was all being done on the back of a piece of paper. I mean, the back of a file.
Yeah.
And back when I was in college, I'd gotten you remember the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEAA, it was called? It was the grant-making part of something in Washington, in the Justice Department, I think, to states and municipalities for them to improve their law enforcement stuff. Knoxville, Tennessee had gotten an LEAA grant to have a computer. They didn't have a computer. And they also didn't have anybody to install it or to figure out what it was going to do there. And I got hired. I was in college still, but I knew a little bit about computers. And I got hired to install the IBM 36040, I think it was, 36075, I'm not sure, in the Knoxville Police Department. And I tell you that story because I came down to Knoxville and I spent 6 months there when I was supposed to be in school, but I was down there figuring out how to use a garbage truck scheduling program that IBM had to figure out where to put police officers so that they could respond to calls quicker, okay, using this computer that we had to run at night, right?
Okay.
All right. Well, Chapter 13 looked like that to me. It just did. It looked like, you're exactly right, it looked like something that you'd put it on a computer and it would take care of itself. It would run. All you'd have to do is put a few numbers in. Yeah.
And so you went and found somebody to write a program.
It turned out that there was a guy in Kansas who was actually doing this. A guy named Claude Rice was his name. And he was actually using the same computer that I had in Knoxville. I understood what he was doing. It made sense to me. And so we moved the whole thing there. And once we did that, it was real easy to get cases into it, and it was easy to get money out, and then it started attracting more attention because it was doing what it was supposed to.
It was beginning to work.
Yeah, it started to work. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we have to look again to see that Bill Brock was getting ready for his campaign for the United States Senate.
He did. He ran.
And there's a meeting, and you're present. Was it Wiseman's office or was it Sasser's office?
No, it was in our offices.
And who came to see Tom Wiseman?
Jim Sasser was there, and Tom was there, and a couple of lawyers from major law firms here in Nashville, from
who we would say are
Sims and
political powers.
Yeah, you would know all of those folks who were in that room.
One of them might have been Frank Gorell, maybe.
He was right over here. Frank was right here. Yeah, it was just exactly the people you'd expect from your reporting years to be in that room. And what was on the table, they were pretty sure they were going to elect a Democrat to the Senate. And to be fair, they wanted Tom Wiseman to run for the Senate. Tom had, I don't think he'd mind me saying so, Tom had a pretty hefty debt coming out of his governor's race. And the party wasn't stepping up real quickly to help him pay the debt. Tom was paying the debt out of all those clients we talked about.
Right, and money was different back then. The debt was about $60,000.
That was exactly what it was, as I remember. And so he was working down that debt, and he couldn't see how he could turn around and run for the Senate unless the party was going to step up and cover his debt and help him finance this thing. And Gorell thought that'd be a stretch. He thought that'd be a stretch, and Sasser wasn't necessarily rich, but he didn't have that coming in. He didn't have that problem coming in. And there was some discussion that day about the fact that there was going to be another district judgeship pretty soon in Nashville, because we justified it and the legislation was there and everything was in process. So there was going to be a federal district judgeship coming up, and it was like, John, it was one of those meetings you read about that actually happened in a room where the people who can decide who's going to do and get what. I was a kid. I just remember being sort of awestruck by this group.
The decision was made, but then they flipped a coin?
They flipped a coin. And they still, when they were honest years later, they still debate who actually won and who lost this coin flip.
But Sasser ran.
Sasser ran, and Tom got the judgeship. But it was a real problem for Tom. I mean, it was too soon. It was too soon. He really wanted to have another half a dozen years or more in practice, because he had this stable of clients. He was making a ton of money, and he loved it. He loved what he was doing. Yeah, but
there goes the rainmaker.
that's right. Sometimes you have to do. Yeah, but it tells you about Tom. He willed me his law practice. I never could have gotten those clients, John. I never could have gotten the wine and spirits wholesalers to take a second look at me by myself. But Tom sat down with the president of the WSWT, with that group, and he said, "Look, just give this guy a chance. Give him a chance, and he'll take care of you. He will." That's what Tom told me. He told them, and they gave me a chance. They did when he left.
Now, but right before that, you had lost a case to an assistant state attorney general, either before the commission or in a court proceeding that had been generated by the commission. At any rate, you lost a case. Who did you lose that case to?
It pissed me off too. There was in the Attorney General's office. You had Joe Haynes over there, who was doing antitrust stuff, and then you had Hank Hildebrand over there, who had gotten the wine and spirit stuff, the licensing stuff, and things like that. And I was constantly running into Hank, and Hank was constantly reading those statutes and regulations and things, and he kept beating me. He understood how the whiskey business worked at the state and federal level, and I really needed to get rid of Hank. I wanted him working with me instead of against me. I really did.
So you got the firm to hire him.
It was this Machiavellian. It was. I had more than I could do because Tom left me his practice, and all of a sudden I had all these clients I didn't know what to do with, and so we were able to convince Hank to come over to the other side, which he did.
So in order to become the Chapter 13 trustee, you first must introduce yourself to whiskey. Is that generally the way it works?
There must be some relationship there.
Yes.
There has to be. But we had the 13 trustee, the 13 thing, and we had the wine and spirits wholesalers, and then Tom went off to the district bench. Yeah.
And the firm fell apart.
It changed. Okay. It changed a lot without Tom there, and you know, John and George Payne, John Chambers and George Payne, they tried some combinations of things. They brought other people into that law firm, Billy Brooks and Harrison. Why am I blanking on?
Marion?
No.
Oh, Ben Harrison.
No, not Ben. He had savings and loan clients. I'll think of his name in a minute too. It's not so important. It's just that I hate forgetting names.
Okay.
But they the firm changed, and I needed a different platform. I needed to be in a different place.
So you linked up with Jack Waddey.
I did. And it was, I knew Jack because Jack had clerked for Harry Phillips. And Jack said to me that we should get a bunch of the old Harry Phillips law clerks together and start a law firm, that there was room for that kind of a group in Nashville. And Jack was an intellectual property guy. He was a patent lawyer, and he had done antitrust stuff in Washington, D.C., and he was bringing that into Nashville. He was going to do that. And it sounded good. It sounded good. Done that, as you know. He ended up very successful in practice because he was good at that, really good at that.
So first it was Waddey and Lundin and Henry Hooker.
And Henry Hooker, yeah.
That didn't work exactly as well as you'd like.
It didn't. Henry was off into the oil and gas business at that time and didn't really want to practice law, but we thought he was going to practice law and that we were going to be his lawyers in the oil and gas stuff. But he ended up pretty much doing his own thing over here. And
So then it became Waddey, Lundin, and Newport.
Yep. Bill Newport.
And y'all built a firm of former law clerks.
We did. We did. The smartest lawyer I've ever known in my life, a guy named Dan Kaufman, who had clerked for Harry Phillips, came down from Washington, D.C. He was doing antitrust stuff up there, moved down here and joined us. I mean, it was really a fun time. It was. Great lawyers.
And Russell Hippie and Ruth Kennard were the bankruptcy. Russell Hippie, Paul Jennings,
yes,
were the bankruptcy judges.
Yes.
And
Paul and Ruth were.
And Paul. Mm-hmm. Wait a minute. Paul. Did we have 3 judges? Paul,
no,
Ruth.
it was Paul and Ruth, but then Ruth left, and Russell, I think, had Ruth's position. Came in.
Yeah, came into Ruth's position.
Yes.
That's right.
Ruth
and Russell left the bench.
Yep.
And you get a call from Wiseman.
From Tom Wiseman, yeah.
The district court picks the bankruptcy judge, not the Sixth Circuit at that time.
That's right. This is in 1981, and at that time the district court made the appointments. And many people have heard this story from George Payne. They've heard his version of it, which is wrong. He made up large parts of it. Please straighten this out.
I was there for the real story. The short version of it is very simple. Tom Wiseman called me up and said, you know, there's a bankruptcy judgeship over here, and I don't know, you know, you're young, but maybe you had some interest in this. Here's what it pays. It was like $54,000 or something like that, and it seems to have pretty good hours and maybe some interesting work. Are you interested? And I said, Tom, wow, thank you. Let me have a couple of days. I want to think about this. And Tom said, that's a good idea. You go talk to some people. Well, my best friend in Nashville, best lawyer friend in Nashville was George Payne, who I'd practiced law with, right? Been in a law firm with and all that stuff.
Perfectly good sense to me.
Well, and George was interesting, had good perspectives on things sometimes. I go to George, and George thinks about it a little while, and we talk a couple of times within a few hours, and he says, Keith, you're too young. You're too young for this. You don't want to go on a federal bench like this at your age. And besides that, you're making too much money over there in that law firm. You got Wiseman left you all these clients. You're in great shape. You need to stay and practice. He literally convinced me not to take the job. So I call up Wiseman and I said, Tom, you know, I've talked to a bunch of people, but George in particular thinks it's just too soon. It's the right thing at the wrong time. And that I should say no, and I really appreciate that you thought of me, but I'm going to pass it. And Tom understood it, and it was within 48 hours of that phone call with Tom Wiseman, I run into Tom Wiseman somewhere. I don't remember where it was, and Tom says, "Hey, you'll never guess what happened." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, well, you know, a little while after I got off the phone with you, I get a call from George. And George says, is that judgeship still open? That bankruptcy judgeship? and I think George is going to take it. I think he is. Well, you know, I didn't feel like killing George. I didn't really, because I think he sincerely talked me out of it. He did. He sincerely, at the time, believed that it was too soon for me. And George was 6 or 7 years older than I am. Mm-hmm. But when I saw George, all of a sudden the story changed, right? All of a sudden George had called me up and talked to me to make sure it was okay if he got this job that he had just talked me out of, which never happened, of course. More than you wanted to know. More than you wanted to know. But George ended up taking the judgeship in right at the end of 1981. He like November or December of 1981.
And shortly after that, Paul Jennings leaves the bench.
I know.
That's Paul. For history, that is Paul E. Jennings, not his son Paul Greg Jennings. Paul G. Jennings.
Yeah. The real Paul. The original Paul.
The original Paul Jennings.
Who clerked for guess who?
Harry Phillips.
Harry Phillips, exactly right. It's part of the cabal, the Nashville legacy of Chief Judge Harry Phillips. Yeah, it's Paul Jennings.
And who calls you?
Phone rings, and it's George Payne. Okay, and this is like
just couldn't have been 60 days after George goes on the bench, on the bankruptcy bench, and George says, Keith, you're not going to believe this. This is more damn fun than you can have doing anything else. It's the best job in the world. And in the next day or two, they're going to announce another vacancy over here. And before they do that, if you have any interest, I would talk you into taking this job now. If I could, I'd talk you into it. And if you want to be considered, you need to jump right now. So I get off the phone with George and call Tom Wiseman and say, Tom, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? George has changed his mind. And now he wants me to apply for this, for what's going to be another job. And Wiseman, who was always so smart about things, he says, get in your car and go find Clerk Morton. Now, Clerk Morton was the chief district judge at that moment. A Republican, as you know.
Yes.
Tom Wiseman's a Democrat, and Tom knows how to get things to happen.
Did you approach Morton, or did Morton call you on his own?
I went to see Clerk Morton. I let him know I was interested in that. I wanted to be considered.
And he was still in Nashville at that time?
And he very kindly said, come on over, let's talk about it. And I did. I went over and spent, it seems like it was hours talking with him. It was probably 10 minutes. But it was, yeah, so I did.
And the rest is history. You went on the bench, and for the next, how many years? 25 years? 30 years?
Too many. Early 82. So I'm in.
Oh, it's
this
more
is,
than 30 years.
I'm in year 35.
Yeah.
We've finished 34. Yeah. So yeah.
So.
Way too many, John. Nobody should do the same thing for as long as I've. But the judgeships are set up that way. They trap you. In terms of your pension and everything, you're trapped until you're 65 years old. And when I went on, I was 30. And so if I'd really thought about it then, I'd have realized it's a kind of 35-year commitment.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of things happened. First of all, let's talk about being the judge. Cases that you oversaw. Any that stand out in particular?
God, it's stuff that nobody else would know about. It was people. It was people who came into bankruptcy because they really needed help, more so than businesses. There were businesses. We all had our share. Some public companies and some not. We did. We saw those cases. You were involved in a bunch of them. George Payne, who was there when I got there, right? And he was there for 30 years, for the first 30 years that I was there. George had a view of judging, and it was formed in no small part, he and I both, from our friendships with other judges, especially Bob Brandt over in the Chancery Court and others, Walter Kurtz and a few others that we really knew. And his view of it was that lawyers ought to be responsible for things. So when you tell me what cases do I remember is lawyers doing a good job. I remember lawyers who took responsibility. I remember lawyers who did things right. Trustees who did things right. That's what feels best about it, is the system ran really well.
Well, the system wasn't much of a system when you started. There was no motion docket.
Yeah.
Tell us briefly how bankruptcy court got its motion docket.
Perfect example.
First of all, let's say this. How do you have a court that doesn't have a motion docket? And I could answer because
you were a victim.
I was a victim of it.
You were a victim.
You would get a notice from the court that says at 2:00 on Thursday afternoon, the motion in Trustee versus Jones is going to be heard. Be here.
Yep.
And if the 1:00 motion wasn't over, you sat there and waited and waited and waited. Or the judge would come on the bench and say, "Oh, I wish y'all had come in earlier because we The motion that preceded you settled.
We've been sitting here with nothing to do.
Yes.
They set something like every 15 minutes or every half an hour, and it was done that way for the first, when I got over there, it was still being done that way. And when I was in practice, it was done that way, and I was one of those people who was sitting there all day long because I would have 10 or 15 Chapter 13 things, and it would take a whole day. It was spread out over a whole day. It was at lunch one day. It was George Payne and I at lunch with Bob Brandt. I mentioned him a minute ago, and we were talking about this really.
Now, he was a chancellor. This was Chancellor Bob Brandt.
Chancellor Bob Brandt. But he was relatively young at the time, because this is really more than 30 years ago, 32, 33 years ago. But the rest of it is that Bob said, well, this is what you need to do. You need to set. If you've got 100 motions that week, set them all on Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. Set them all together, same time. And he said, first of all, I guarantee you that 80 or 90% of them will settle before you get there, or soon thereafter, because those people don't want to wait around all week to get heard. But also, it's very efficient. It'll be efficient for you. You won't be waiting for the next case to come to the courthouse. They're going to be in the courtroom already. They'll be sitting there. God, was he prophetic? I mean, he just fixed it. He fixed our system. He did. Bob did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then there was a U.S. District Court judge in Florida who influenced you and started pretrial conferences for us.
I liked litigation. I liked being a trial lawyer, and Tom Wiseman was a consummate trial lawyer. He was really good, and I watched him for the years that I had with him, and I tried cases afterwards. And I remember early on in the early '80s going to a Federal Judicial Center meeting, and there was a district judge there, a woman named Susan Black was her name, a district judge in Florida. And the dockets down there were already hellacious because of all the drug stuff they were trying to do in the district courts, and they were never getting to their civil cases, and they needed to come up with some way to streamline civil litigation in the district courts in the Southern District of Florida. And she came up with this whole pretrial process of using the federal rules to get everybody together and schedule out when things were going to happen and set deadlines for discovery and all this stuff. Look, this was all new stuff. This was right before the 1983 Federal Rules of Civil Procedure came in, which was the big rule. That was when the big rules came in. It was 1983. She'd already kind of figured all this stuff out. And I sat down with her after that meeting and got all her forms.
This was a continuing legal education program.
Judges, a bunch of baby judges, and she was one of the speakers to the baby judges. And I got all her forms and everything. And we're still doing it about the same way. We are. 30, 35 years later, whatever it is. Yeah, she was brilliant. And
she's now on the 11th Circuit.
Is that where she is?
Uh-huh.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, if you need to talk to her, that's where she is.
That's too good. Boy, she was a help. She really got us in the right direction.
And how now in the scope of things in the bankruptcy court, we pick up Marion Harrison along the way as one of the judges.
And later before that.
Oh, that's right.
See, George Payne and I were to get alone until, for too long. We had too many cases for two judges. Mm-hmm. In fact, for many years in the 90s, in the early 90s, we were the busiest bankruptcy court on a per judge basis in the whole country. We're number 9 right now in the country in terms of workload per judge. We've always been a little behind on it, but we went after a judge, and in the 1994 amendments, we got another judge, and that's when Aleda came in.
Aleda, author, Tralker.
Right, which...
She was the assistant United States attorney who brought down Governor Ray Bland.
And she was also the most attractive woman in my freshman class at Vanderbilt Law School. It was Aleda Arthur.
Yes.
And we became best friends. In fact, and her first husband, John, he was a philosopher, the head of the philosophy department at Tennessee State. But Aleda, we got our third judgeship in
seems like 94. And so she was our third judge, and she was there for 5 years. And then Marion came in 99. But, you know, Leda then got, I think she was Bill Clinton's last judicial appointment. I think that's right. One of his last. Keeping in mind that Byron
Trauger, her second husband, and current husband, had been with Bill Clinton at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship.
And Aleda might even remember that I introduced her to Byron. That's too much.
Okay.
No, we won't go there.
But you picked up Sonny Ray as a court clerk.
Yeah? George found him. George did. George Payne found Sonny Ray from the military academy. He was there's a name for that, John, you probably know it. The guy
he was in charge. He was the regimental or brigade, whatever they have at West Point, S3, which is in charge of supplies, buildings and grounds, that type of thing.
All the civilian employees too.
Yes.
He had thousands of employees there. He had all the civilians working for him and everything. Yeah. And George still had this military thing going because George always did, but he was right. I was a little worried about having too many military people. I had George already, but he was right about Sonny. Sonny was real good.
And this begins with this team, Keith Lundin, Sonny Ray, and George, who probably doesn't care one way or the other. We began to computerize the courts.
Yeah.
You were on the cutting edge. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sonny was amenable to the idea that everything we do in bankruptcy, fits into a matrix of one kind or another. I mean, you can put all the creditors on one, and you can keep track of money on one, and trustees could file all their reports that way. And the federal courts were moving so slowly. You know, your law firm had more technology than any court did, and 5 years before it happened, you did. And so we started stealing money, literally, from one thing or another that we could, and getting computers and hiring people to program them in-house, and we were trying
So you didn't go to Claude this time?
Didn't go to Claude.
Okay.
No, but we started working on it, and Sonny was right at the edge of that. He really was, and happy to do it. And then the feds came along with the electronic case filing system, and they needed guinea pigs. And we volunteered first to be a guinea pig for this electronic case filing system. And we were one of the 6 courts that had it right away, the very first time before it was public. And it was dreadful. It was broken. I mean, morons had created this thing. We had a better prototype in our own court that Sonny and a couple of the folks there had come up with. So we declined to be part of it. And they rolled it out anyway, and you know what you got. What you got a couple of years later was the electronic case filing system,
which I have a secretary who understands, and if she were to die tomorrow, I would have to retire.
She's one of 5 people in the world who understand how to make it work. It's still broken. Yeah.
And
yeah, but that we did. We computerized the bankruptcy courts. Yeah. We did.
I believe you told me when we met to talk about what you would talk about, you made the comment that governments adopt the mean, not the cutting edge. Mm-hmm. And this brings us, I attend a lot of continuing legal education programs because Mrs. McLemore likes to go to continuing legal education programs, especially the ones
likes you to go to.
Yes, especially the ones that are in like Jackson Hole or Santa Fe, New Mexico, or San Francisco, California.
This is good.
And so I attend a lot of them. And you were as harsh a critic of the horribly named Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005. By that time, you had put together your team, your CLE program, which got you into fishing holes around the nation. And you, Henry, Bill Brown from Memphis. We're putting on a recent cases program in Chapter 13, which is unrivaled around the nation. There's nobody that comes close to competing with you all. And
Look, how could you go wrong with Hank Hildebrand? I mean, Hank is theater. He's an actor. He's always on stage, and he knows how to. He's got the timing to be a comedian. And Hank starts talking, and he gets all of the theater stuff going, and I'm his straight man, and I have been since 1979 when we started doing programs.
And you wear bowling shirts.
Well, that was a necessity. We were traveling so much and doing so many programs, and you think about it, it was traveling with coats and ties and suits and changes of clothes was a pain. It was just too much. So we figured out if we looked stupid, and Hank he said, well, let's have a costume. The theater guy, right?
Yeah.
You know, he got his start as a 9-foot tall fiddle out at Opryland. That's how he earned his way through law school or undergraduate, whatever it was. Yeah, he's that guy. But he said, let's have a costume, and that's where the bowling shirt stuff started. And then we didn't have to carry a coat and tie anymore.
Where did the recent bankruptcy activity quiz come from, and pitching out Jack Daniel's whiskey to the audience, Goo Goo candy bars and things like that?
I started that about 25 years ago when I said to Hank one day, we are boring if it's just us. We need to do something besides just talk about cases. And we tried 2 or 3 different things, and the trivia was the one that worked. And then Hank had a friend or a client, I can't remember who, had something to do with Goo Goo, with the company, Standard Candy Company. And so we just tried that. We tried moon pies also, and moon pie didn't work as well as Goo Goos do. The Tennessee Viagra approach, right?
Yes.
And then the Jack Daniels came a little later, but it was a way to break it up, to make it not just talking heads, not just us. Yeah.
And on that roadshow, you went around the nation calling something that is the initials of which are BAP, BAP, CPA, which is unpronounceable, but you managed to pronounce it BAP Crappa.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah.
It works. Yeah, I got in trouble for that at first.
At first,
I did.
I can't imagine how.
Just after it was passed, the director of the Executive Office of the United States Trustee came up to me after a program and said, didn't suggest, said that he thought it was inappropriate to refer to an act of Congress as BAP Crappa. And that convinced me I was on the right track. I knew I was on the right track. John, you don't want to hear that. Maybe you do. I don't know. This is kind of the end of the 35 years, right? And I feel depressed about where we've ended up. I do. And I'm not going to tell you I got to take personal responsibility for the mess that Congress has made of bankruptcy. I'm not going to take personal responsibility. But I'd like to think that my generation of judges and you and I as trustees and judges and folks who ran, I mean, you've been a trustee almost as long as I've been a judge. And you're what you drive the train. You make the system work, and I'm back there as the backstop. But I thought we had a pretty good system going. And by pretty good, it was honest, it was pretty fair. It was a balance of debtor and creditor stuff, and I don't think I'm just being an old fart when to say that what happened in 2005 was an injustice, a gigantic injustice. A bunch of yahoos took over Congress, and
they're called bankers, and I've been a trustee longer than you've been a judge, but. They are.
That's right.
They're
Sorry, I didn't mean to insult you.
I was filing Chapter 13s when you were a Chapter 13 trustee.
And I was a trustee. That's right.
But Let's get back to the ranch. The banks got control of Congress.
They did.
And they convinced the nation that people were cheating in bankruptcy, and there's always going to be some.
Yeah.
But they were not.
No, it was a big fraud. It was a fraud on all of us because we're 10 years later and we're still suffering. We're spending millions and millions of dollars unnecessarily trying to give people a second chance, financial chance in their lives. It wasn't about fraud. It was about killing bankruptcy, about getting rid of it. And they did. We got 800,000 bankruptcies today. We had 1.5 million then. So we got half as much bankruptcy. And I'm sure there's some people who will watch this and say, well, that's a good thing. Well, it's a good thing, except think about the alternative for that other 750,000 people who aren't filing bankruptcy and aren't able to pay their debts. Where are they going, John? Where are those people right now? I think they're mad. I think they're getting mad and getting madder and getting madder.
Yeah.
That's what I think. And it's bad. It's a bad outcome. It's always been our safety valve that people get a second chance. And we made the door so small and we made it so hard to get through a bankruptcy that a lot of people who need it can't do it right now. They can't. And I'm not going to live long enough to see the pendulum swing back, I'm afraid. I don't think I'm going to see it get back to a better balance. So it makes me sad a little bit. More than a little bit, makes me sad, yeah.
Let's go next to tell me about those people. Tell me about 3 or 4 of those people who have had, other than Harry Phillips, who have had for good or bad, influence on Keith Lundin that made a difference in your life.
Wow. People who made a difference. Boy, I'm going to get in trouble here by not remembering people. You know, you've hit some important ones. Harry Phillips, for whatever, and Tom Wiseman and George Payne, right off the top of that stack, are people who have huge impact on me. And you mentioned another one a little while ago, and that was John Arthur. Funny, not a lawyer at all. John was a philosopher, but a very, very thoughtful one. And he died. He's passed away. But John always made you step back and realize that there's a bigger picture about things. And he was into John Rawls and all those guys. And for years and years, we had a study group that got together. Bob Brandt, who always had his feet on the ground, guy from Norris, Tennessee, you know, who incidentally ended up married to my next door neighbor's girlfriend, I'm sorry, from Oak Ridge. It's all incest, John. I mean, Ann Brandt at one time was dating my next door neighbor in Oak Ridge. And the next time I saw her, about 10 years later, she's married to Bob Brandt. But Bob had a lot of influence in lots of ways, by just being so practical and always seeing through system issues about courts and about how courts ought to work. He was so good at that. Those are people.
What about professors? What about teachers along the way?
Oh, professors. Yeah, there's one guy, nobody would have any reason to know him. He's actually in a nursing home right here in Nashville, Tennessee now. A guy named Irwin Hargrove is his name. Irwin ended up down here after being head of the political science department at Brown. He got lured away by the Vanderbilt Institute of Public Policy Studies, by Phillips, and ended up down here. I know Siegenthaler's group over there at Vanderbilt, at Phillips. He was a student of the presidency, Hargrove was, and about how people get things done. And I was his. He mentored me in college when I was off doing those independent studies I told you about. Well, Hargrove kept pulling me back to do something useful. He was influential. You know, I'm sure there's other people, and I'm going to be mad an hour from now when I don't.
You have 2 children.
2 children and a stepson also. I have
okay.
2.5.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I do.
And I don't want to detract from any of your children. I have 3 children, and they're all very, very special.
They're perfect, John. Your
Of course.
children are perfect. I've met your children, and they are all perfect.
As are yours. But one of the themes that goes through here is Rhodes Scholarship. And
Isn't that funny?
yeah, and I saw on television one time an interview with Yo-Yo Ma. And he said in that interview that his great-grandfather told his grandfather that their family should set as a goal developing a really, really fine musician, and that he felt it would take 3 generations to do that.
Wow, that's incredible.
And the 3 generations were the grandfather, the parents, and the son, and Yo-Yo Ma was the son. Your grandfather immigrated from Russia. We can only, especially if he came out of Siberia rather than the Polish border, we can only imagine that
it was wood.
He knew how to chew walrus blubber and stuff like that.
He was a woodcutter.
Yes, okay. But probably was not academically trained. Your father took a giant step. He got a college education in the Depression.
Yeah, he did.
Then you got an Ivy League education, and your son got a North Carolina education that took him to a Rhodes Scholarship. That's Ben. Tell us a little bit about Ben.
You just did. Jessica, my daughter, is a doctor. She ended up as a doctor here in town now. She's got a practice just starting up here, made it through med school. Ben, I don't know how you describe it. I wish I had his toolbox. I wish I could do the things that he can do.
What does he do now?
He's a master of the universe, John. And you know what that's like, because you've got a son just like him, who everything he touches, he figures out how to make it work. He's doing a startup right now that has to do with breastfeeding mothers and getting lactation consultation at 3 o'clock in the morning. Go figure. All right? It's the new world, right? And it's all on your iPhone.
Okay.
That's what he's doing right now. In a way, Oak Ridge is like a case study in that kind of upward mobility, or whatever you want to call it. What an opportunity it was, in a way, to take 6,000 or 8,000 engineers who are going to go off and be normal and make them invent a bomb, right? And give them 24 months to do it. My father ended up with 800 patents, his little group, and they used them as wallpaper. I've seen The Office. The patents were actually issued, right? They got the patents and they used them to wallpaper a room.
Wow.
Because it meant nothing to them, really. It was just exciting. Well, it went that way.
And the third child?
R.A., my stepson, is a lawyer over in Virginia. Yeah, good compass, good solid guy. Yeah, really proud of him for making it.
And what are you going to do next?
Everything.
So you retire on what day?
6/16/16, June 16th, 2016, which is today's the 1st. That's 45 days from now. Okay. I think, maybe 44, 45 days from today.
What are you going to do?
I'm going to do everything, John. I'm not done. I'm not done. I don't need to go hide anywhere. I get off the bench, so I get that time back. And I've got a book that's now 17,000 pages long online.
Your treatise.
And it's behind because I can't keep it current and do all the court stuff. And so I'm gonna get it current. I'm gonna keep teaching and writing and speaking, and all of that's over there. And then I'm gonna do whatever comes along that looks like it's worth it. I don't want to go out and hang up a shingle. I'm not interested in just practicing law, but
I think there's some interesting things out there to do still. And if they come along, I'm going to go do them. I am, whatever it happens to be.
Where's your favorite place to fish?
Boy, you are finished with this, aren't you? My favorite place to fish.
Yeah, your favorite place to
Oh,
fish. Because you've traveled all over the United States. That's one of the things you say.
It's an
easy where can I go fishing?
It's an easy question. It is. It's so easy. It is, because you've probably been there, and it's the Green River in Utah.
I have been there.
Yeah.
A tributary to the Colorado.
Colorado. There's about 30 miles of that river down below the big dam. I'll think of the name of it tomorrow. Yeah, that would be where I'd go. Good place to fish, but and I'll do a little fishing too. But I'm not. My hobbies. My job has always gotten in the way of all the things that are really fun. The speaking and teaching and all that. That's fun, John. That gets your blood moving.
Where will you teach?
Don't know. Wherever it happens.
Okay.
Wherever it happens. Yeah. Yeah, we'll see.
Now, do you want to look at the camera and say anything else?
Do I want to say anything else? I do, actually. It's kind of funny. I hope that 20 or 30 years from now, if somebody looks at this, that we'll have come to our senses about being broke and about having a second or third chance in life, and how it has been a fundamental part of what makes us great. We don't suffer generation after generation when somebody tries something new and it doesn't work. You get to take a deep breath, step back, and start over. Well, you can't begin to estimate how important that is to us as a culture, and we've lost sight of that. And I hope when somebody thinks about this over the decades ahead, they realize that we got to pull this thing back to keep our engine running. We got to pull it back, or we're going to kill the golden goose. We're going to kill the innovation and the risk-taking that makes us great. And I hope, I made whatever contribution I did, and I think I was mostly a referee in the capital letter sense than a playmaker. But maybe some of the playmakers out there will fix it and get us back in the middle of the road again. That's what I hope. Yeah.
I do too.
So maybe it won't leak the way it is right now.
Let's leave it with that. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fun.